Consider how many IT pros have been installing domain controllers and how long they've been doing that for. The domain controller is the mainstay of the local area network. It's generally in every network, big and small, because a network can't operate without a domain controller. However, as technology has changed and the landscape has changed, have IT professionals' practices also evolved? Is the reason that a domain controller is installed on-prem now more about doing things the way it's always been done, or is it more about that it is the most appropriate technology for the environment? So the question you need to ask if you're installing domain controllers is exactly that. Am I doing this simply because I'm comfortable with it, or because this is the best solution for the customer and the environment that I'm currently configuring? So most IT pros and resellers have moved things like email to the cloud, but what about the domain controller? Why is the domain controller still so common in our environment and typically something that is installed immediately or first off out of the bat these days? Again, why aren't more resellers taking advantage of the opportunities the cloud has to offer rather than simply falling back on what they are used to doing? So if they are falling back on what they're used to doing and they're making this default decision without looking at the new technology, what implications may that have for their business in the future? What implications may it have for them and their profession and their knowledge in the future? So I would suggest to you that if you are simply installing a domain controller out of habit, then you may be in for a rude shock down the track. Now, we're looking at a new world order here. In the old way of thinking, the domain controller was the top of our heap in our network. It controlled our member servers and our workstations. However, what we're finding is today, as devices and users become more mobile, our workstations are moving outside the environment. They're moving to places where they aren't connected by a blue cable to the server. So again, we're finding that devices are moving outside the control of the domain controller. The same is true with member servers. A lot of the applications on these servers are being moved to dedicated SaaS applications run from a web page, so therefore less need for the traditional domain controller. So again, the domain controller functioned very well when everything was within the boundary of the LAN, but that is becoming less and less the case every day. The trend is for devices and users to move anywhere, and especially more so outside the business, thanks to mobility. So what did our domain controllers do? What actual roles did a domain controller take? Well, it did a lot of things. It basically controlled the identity and security of our users. It did Windows 7, 8 and machine joins and made them secure on our network. It did group policy, allow us to configure LDAP, DNS, certificate services, organizational units to make it easy to manage our environment, Kerberos. But then where it started to struggle was when it came to doing modern things like mobile device joins. So we can't connect our mobile devices to the domain, therefore we can't apply things like group policy to manage, maintain and configure these. The same thing for web-based and software-based applications that are deployed from the cloud like Office 365. So yes, you can add additional functionality, you can add additional software to do this, but out of the box, our domain controllers really have no concept of connectivity to cloud services. Now, what role did a domain controller play for most resellers' business? Well, it provided hardware revenue. When a new domain was installed or when there was a migration, there was a new server to buy and configuration and disks and all that sort of stuff. So there was hardware revenue to be made. Likewise, there was also software, new licensing, updated versions of Windows, client access licenses and so on. So typically a simple percentage margin was added and resold out and provided a nice revenue stream. Of course, there was maintenance, keeping the machine up and running, make sure that if there were disk failures and so on, they were replaced and taken care of, and obviously the machine was backed up regularly. There was support required from the domain, so creating users, resetting passwords. Most of that was far too complex for users to do, so they outsourced it to resellers. So again, another option here was the migration, moving the domain from one set of hardware or an environment to another. So there was a good deal of revenue to be made through this traditional environment. But as the domain controller has been deprecated, what happens to this revenue? Typically, it's also going to be deprecated, and there's not as much opportunity to make profit when the domain controller is basically being moved to the cloud. So what didn't a domain controller do well? Well, in most SMB environments, there was only a single domain controller. Sure, you could have more, but most environments only had a single domain controller. This meant that if it was unavailable for some reason, it was down, it had problems, then basically no one could connect to it, and work would typically stop until that domain controller came back up. Now, that obviously could be a major pain point, could be a case of drop everything and try and fix it. So again, a single point of failure was never a good thing in a modern business environment. And I don't know how many people have tried to recover and restore a domain controller, but there is a certain amount of knowledge you need to do that, and you don't want to be learning that on the job. The domain controller also didn't manage their identities well when they moved outside the business. When the managing director took holidays and wanted to access their information from a remote location, managing and verifying that identity proved difficult. VPNs were required, holes in firewalls, maybe third-party software became difficult to do because the domain controller was housed on-prem. It was designed to verify people who live within the local area network on the same cabling. When that changed, the domain controller began to struggle. Likewise, managing remote users. How do we verify that device is not doesn't have malware on? How do we know that the user is the actual user using that device? So as the devices moved outside the environment, they became more difficult for the domain controller to manage. Same thing with security. We talked about managing passwords and how they were updated and how we could enforce that. Again, it became very difficult once devices and users started moving outside the environment. And allowing external users who may not be part of the environment. Okay, so users who wanted to come in to work and collaborate on a short-term project proved difficult to manage and allow and give access to using a traditional domain controller. They would typically need a login, and that would require licensing and so on and so forth. So it became very difficult to do for a traditional domain controller. Now, as we know, the world has changed and the world continues to change. So we're looking at the new world of cloud technologies. Again, we're looking at a hybrid environment, some from the cloud, some from on-prem. We're looking at a world where software is so important and where things like mobility and devices drive users and drive the environment we have today. A good example of some of the significant changes that I see on the horizon is the blockchain technology. Now, the most obvious manifestation of that is the Bitcoin currency. And this is certainly proving to be very, very successful, and I think will play a larger and larger role in technologies because blockchain allows us to verify trust through a set of mathematical formulas, cryptography, okay? Imagine an environment where a domain controller worked like blockchain, a distributed network where identity was verified by mathematical algorithms and wasn't owned by any individual and also supported a distributed network. Now, one of the challenges of that sort of environment would be getting people's information into blockchain. Yes, we could do it, but we need to get our identities into there. So another option to consider here is maybe we've already got a network out there that has a lot of information about our users and our identities and what we did, especially in a work context. Well, I would contend to you that if you looked at something like LinkedIn, that definitely has a lot of that information already in there, a globally distributed network, a lot of people already on it using it to manage their identities. Of course, Microsoft recently purchased LinkedIn and is using that to push information at this stage, typically things like CRM data and personal job information into products like Office 365, but why couldn't LinkedIn also be a domain controller player, global domain controller, where basically you would log into a business, they would associate your LinkedIn profile ID with the company while you worked there. When you left, they would update the profile with the information and they would disassociate it, and you would then associate it with the next company you work for. So Again, maybe not possible, but I would suggest to you that LinkedIn is not simply a CRM play on Microsoft's part. Hopefully you're aware of this example here of the way the world is moving from our left to our right. We're moving from a world of packaged software through infrastructure, platform as a service, and then into software as a service. So our packaged software in the environment of a domain controller is we would have to buy the hardware, we would have to configure it, we would have to build it, we would have to install the operating system, we would then have to add the domain controller function. On top of that, we'd have to manage, maintain everything, so we'd be responsible for that. Economically, we'd have to buy the equipment up front, order it, and then we'd have to maintain it over its lifespan. It would need to be available for its whole lifespan. Now, to reduce the cost gives us some more flexibility, we move to infrastructure as a service. So hosting the machine in a virtual machine run on Azure means that Microsoft looks after the virtualization of our servers and our networking. We need to only maintain, manage the the operating system, middleware and data. So we can basically spin up a VM which is running Windows, configure a domain role, and then we're up and running with our domain controller. We're charged by the second, so what that machine runs, and we still would need to run the domain controller for the full period because people would need to access it. So we're now into a time-based billing model. We don't have that upfront cost, but we're still running basically a per second cost. Now, if we look at domain controllers platform as a service, this is where Microsoft or whomever looks after everything all the way up to the runtime. So they would provide us domain controllers as a service. We just make sure our users are in there. They would maintain those, back them up, make sure they're highly available. Now, the difference here, once we move to platform as a service, we're only billed by transaction. So no longer are we billed by time or upfront cost. We're just billed by the number of times we access those services. So if you need 2 verifications a day, that's all you pay for. You're not paying for the total time having it running, which is more efficient, more cost effective. The last option is software as a service. So again, imagine this is the LinkedIn scenario. LinkedIn as a domain controller, no cost generally for you to pay because that's maintained as a large service and potentially supported by advertising or subscription perhaps as well. One monthly cost to cover everything. So rather than being a time-based or a transaction-based, you pay a flat fee. So they're the models that you can think of when it comes to cloud computing and the domain controller, and all of those, I believe, are very, very possible. Now, as I've mentioned, one of the most important concepts and I suppose trends is the fact that software will eat the world. Now, if you haven't read the article by Mark Andreessen where he talks about this a number of years ago, I strongly suggest you go and do a search for Software Will Eat the World and read what he has to say, and again keep it in context of the fact it was written a number of years ago and really how closely we've progressed to that point. We live in a world where networks are now basically spun up by software. You create a script, use JSON templates, and you spin up a network. You spin up a domain controller based on the script. This gives you consistency, gives you repeatability. And again, if you're still not deploying a domain controller via software and scripting, then it's probably not as efficient as it could be. Okay, so now we can deploy the whole thing via a script. We can take that script and redeploy it to another domain controller quickly and easily with very, very minor changes. Now, software can also help us not only run up our domain controllers, it can also help us maintain them. We can use things like side state configuration to make sure our domain controllers remain on spec, that they don't have any rogue software on there, they're patched and they're always up to date. Now, taking that extension another step further, what about the ability for AI systems to configure a domain controller? I just need a domain controller, push a button, and the AI agent goes out and works out the best size of machine, how many objects are supported, database sizes, and so on. Why do you even have to worry about running it up? Just need a domain controller for so many users. Now, the concept here is to consider is, how are your software skills? How comfortable are you with using things like PowerShell, JSON, those sort of things which are all software based? So going forward, it's going to be more and more important for resellers and IT pros to be comfortable using software to basically create the infrastructure they traditionally used to do on-prem. Another major change in the environment is the mobility fact. People expect to be able to access their information whether they are on their desktop in their office or on their back of a motorcycle somewhere in Europe. Okay, people want to access their information wherever they are. They don't want to be limited in any way. So this means by association that their identity is also going to have to travel wherever they are, because that's the first thing that will need to be verified before they're able to get to that information. So what role does a domain controller perform when it needs to be available everywhere? It means that it can't live inside an on-premise environment behind a firewall which doesn't allow external access. It has to be somewhere where the user can access it anywhere, anytime. But building an environment to do that outside the corporate network is quite hard. It's difficult. It's not something a domain controller does well, a traditional domain controller does well. Okay, how do we solve this problem? Because again, more and more users are moving outside this environment, and is fast becoming the standard and the requirement for all organizations. Another big change is the dominance of the device. We're moving from a world where the PC on the desktop was the center of the world, the universe for the world, the universe for the user. In this case, we're now looking at devices. Everybody's got one, possibly two or three other devices they use. They have their identity, their files, their personal files, their corporate files. They like their devices. They want to work with their devices because it gives them the flexibility and allows them, in many cases, to express who they are. Now, one of the key differences here to think about is these devices typically are running operating systems that are not from Microsoft. They are run from operating systems developed by Google and iOS and Apple. How do you manage those? How do you apply policies, procedures, security to an environment that isn't based on Microsoft? They're not going to support group policy. They're not going to connect to a domain controller because they're provided by third parties. They simply don't connect to networks in the same old way. So again, this adds an additional layer of complexity, and it makes things more challenging when it comes to doing the management and configuration of this. Security is also so important now. These devices are easy to lose. They're easy to be compromised. They're easy to be stolen. What happens? They're no longer inside four walls that can be protected by a locked door. How is this going to be able to be managed in an environment where a domain controller was inside an environment? Okay, what happens if we don't give the users exactly what they need, or we don't fulfill their needs? Well, in today's world, they're simply going to go out and implement themselves. They're going to find a cloud service, and they're going to implement shadow IT and implement services directly from the web to do what they need. This is going to create all sorts of problems, fragmentation, security, and whatnot. But again, you need to work with the users and give them what they need. If you don't, they'll simply go out and find alternate solutions without consulting IT pros. We also need to look at this concept of pets versus cattle. We need to move away from a world where everything is a custom installation, everything is a custom spin up. We need to get to a world where we basically need a brown cow or a black cow to do a job. When we need the next one, we simply run a script and we get the same cow. All right, so we're moving from a world where we have lots and lots of different pets to a world where we have consistency. Right, maintaining unique entities is time consuming. Okay, how do you cater to all the individual needs if everything is unique? Right, infrastructure domain controllers are there to perform a function. When it fails, we simply replace it. We want to have identical and consistent implementations, which is going to mean things like using software and scripting to give us standard packages. Again, have a look at the way mobile phones are sold. The packages that they implement, again, they're done with standard packages. Now, in the Microsoft world, what sort of solution have we got to accommodate this that is being deployed from the cloud? Well, we've got Azure Active Directory, which will give us our identity and our access control. It will give us typically the ability to do a lot of the stuff that our domain controllers were doing, and we'll see that it comes in three versions: a free, basic, and a premium. Now, here is another change. We're looking at a new economic model here that means that there are free offerings. I mean, how many people have ever given a free evaluation domain controller to customers? Very few. But the new model is all about freemium. It's all giving people a try, giving people a taste, even with basic functionality. The expectation is we get some sort of free offering. So again, is your business model able to cope with that sort of deployment? Now, if we take the solution from Azure AD and we compare it to our traditional on-prem environment, let's see how it stacks up. So they both do user identity and security, which is great. But when it comes to Windows 7 and Windows 8 machine joins, our Azure AD just won't do that. We can generally join Windows 10 machines to both, which is great, but as we work through things like group policy, organizational units, Kerberos, and so on, we see how Azure AD is not designed out of the box to do that. However, the newer technologies like mobile devices and Office 365 is supported. So again, we cannot say that an Azure AD is a direct replacement for an on-prem domain controller. However, the way to think about it is Azure AD gives us our basic functionality to which we then add additional cloud-based services based on what we need. When we buy a domain controller, we get everything, whether or not we use it. In the case of Azure AD, we buy the pieces we want, we put them together to get the solution depending on our need. So the idea here is that we do have a point of control in the cloud with Azure AD. We can control our on-prem environments, our cloud-based services, and our PC devices thanks to Azure AD. Because it's available via the internet, we can synchronize information from our on-prem environment, our on-prem Linux servers. We can connect to cloud-based systems from Microsoft and third parties, and we can now manage our devices. So Azure AD fulfills a lot of the requirements that we need in the modern world. It's going to allow us to do that, and with the addition of certain features, functionality, and add-ons, we can certainly make it play the role that a typical domain controller was playing, but without many of the downsides. So the way we need to think about this these days is we build solutions from the cloud by taking pieces and connecting them together. No longer is there a single monolithic solution that does everything that we used to require. We simply get the pieces, we connect the pieces or add the pieces we want. We only pay for what we need. Very, very different technology model. Okay, so we buy the individual components, we put them together. So think of Azure, for example, as a domain controller thrown up in the air, broken into constituent pieces, and now we just pick and choose exactly what we need based on our requirements. So the reality here is in today's world, we no longer have one size that fits all. Even in small business these days, there is not one size that fits all. People want something that's customized to them. They don't want to overpay for stuff. They don't want to pay for stuff they don't use. The analogy I like to use is coffee. If you go and buy coffee today, you typically need to specify what sort: long black, short black, latte, cappuccino. You need to specify what size: big, small, medium, what sort of sugar, what sort of milk. So again, the idea is you get a custom tailored to your exact needs, to exact taste. You don't simply go and get a standard coffee. It just doesn't work across every single environment anymore. Now, that brings with it not only a requirement, but also an expectation of a tailored product. Everybody's expecting a tailored product, and this goes down also to technology, okay? It is so many ways. It makes people really think and want something that's different from others. So it's very much in my thinking along coffee. So look how many different versions of coffee, thanks to that Wikipedia article. Again, this is the variables, this is the environment we live in, this is the environment that we have to work with, and the way that we do that is we build it up from its constituent pieces rather than providing a monolithic solution. Now, moving into this new environment economically and technology means that we also are going to have to examine our business model, and we're really going to have to shift that as well. We're going to have to shift, like I said, to a world of cloud, to a world of platform as a service, mobile, consumption, pay by transactions. This is definitely going to mean a change of business model, because you need to be competitive. You need to give customers what you want. Again, the move is from on-prem environment where you're billing up front to a transaction based, to a per month, per user cost. We're moving away from billing for time. We're billing for usage. Again, look at the way that things like Azure storage go, where it's transaction based, typically not time based. Microsoft is now doing managed disks for VMs. taking the load off the individual need to manage it for each dish. So we need to ask here, what needs to change, and how are we as resellers and IT pros going to make those changes? So part of it, firstly, is we need to embrace the fact that the only thing that's constant is change. Things are just changing rapidly and will continue to do so. Not embracing that, not coming up with a system, not dealing with that is really going to make it hard, because it's simply the way of the world now. We have to come up with a system to deal with it, because we cannot influence or make any change to that. It's just simply the way the world is. So the solution is to put in processes that will help you manage and understand that constant change. You can use RSS feeds, you can use channels, you can use all sorts of things to pull that information to you. You should look at using social media tools, following influencers, following topics, rather than just reading through generic news or whatever, or doing random queries on the internet. You need to create this culture where learning is part of your organization and of your personal development. It's now a world where there's not much room for a lone gun. You just can't do it all anymore. You need to work out what you're good at, and then get others to help you to have the skill set across all the range of things you need to. You cannot do it all. Pick what you do well and outsource to others. Take the opportunities at networking events and conferences to meet people, to find people and let them know what your services are, but also to look to fill gaps in your portfolio. What do you need? And again, you would look to something like social media as well to give you that sort of information and those sort of individuals. Focus, again, is so important. Do what is profitable. You don't do what you love, because that ignores the market, right? People tell you do what you love and you'll always make money. Well, that's not true. You can do what you love, but unless people are prepared to pay for it, then it's going to be pretty lonely and pretty unprofitable. So do what you're good at. There will always be demand for high range skills. Focus on those, make them better. And again, don't do the stuff which is unprofitable, right? Again, look to outsource that and look to reduce the amount of overhead. Why have I got so many vendors? Why am I buying things and doing things so many different ways? Why can't I make it more consistent, more automated, more in a way that is easier to deploy? So in essence, remember that revenue is vanity and profit is sanity. Focus on profit. What are you going to make? Where's the return on this investment? Now, we've mentioned the importance of software, PowerShell, scripting, automation, software-defined networking, Azure Quick Start templates. You've really got to get comfortable with the fact that we've moved to a world of software, and that's the way to be most efficient going forward. And we need to look at focusing on services, right? You can't make good money on hardware or licensing or software out of the box. You really need to, where's the value add? What can I add around these products that other people aren't doing? Where's the power that I can provide to this environment? Now, the good thing is with environments like Office 365, which are widespread, you can now sell those services anywhere once you're able to add them on to the standard offerings from people like Microsoft. Now, not only is there a change when we're looking at domain controllers that I've been using as an example here, but let's just look at a few other quick examples here. So the first example I'll give you is the new deployment method Microsoft is talking about when it comes to an RDS farm. So as you can see here, the RDS farm now no longer lives in the domain. It's domain independent. It doesn't need a domain controller. Now, when you look at the back end of this environment, the configuration, you might notice something different. The difference here is that the roles of the servers are basically not VMs, okay? They're web services. They're platform as a service role. There are no VMs here for you to manage. Microsoft manages that. You just put the web roles, the web services on top of that. Now, why do we do that? Well, the reason is that because we're running platform as a service, we're going to get scalability. Now, what I mean here is if you look, you'll see that we can set up a rule that says that when the CPU usage of our farm gets above 70% on average, increase the instance, add another virtual machine, scale up. When that CPU drops down below 30%, remove a machine, take it back to the norm. So this means now, thanks to the scalability built into Platform as a Service, you can simply toggle a few things, and then Microsoft worries about how to load balancers, connect them up, spin up the VMs. You only pay for the time that's running. You don't pay for having to accommodate at the highest level. You simply do it and then set up the scaling to allow this. So again, this is the power, this is the benefit of doing something in PaaS. Okay, so again, it doesn't mean that things like the domain controller will disappear overnight, but what it's going to mean is that these new abilities in things like PaaS means that the people that design the operating system and the service do it well, and all you need to do is basically add the value around the scaling in this example. Now, if we look at the Microsoft 365 business and we delve into this and we read what Microsoft says about it, you'll notice here a couple of key things. So to realize the full value, basically it says customers may choose to connect Microsoft 365 Business to an Active Directory, but it is not recommended. So Microsoft is telling you it's not recommended to do the traditional connection of Windows 10 machines to an on-prem AD. And in fact, as you see here, the product is specifically designed to avoid using a traditional Active Directory. All right, so again, what we're seeing is Microsoft is again encouraging you or telling you that the role of the traditional domain controller is being deprecated. There's no need to have AD on-prem, okay? So this is the sort of question you ask, do I really need a domain controller? Now, is a domain controller required? Of course, there may be some cases where it is, but these are the questions you need to ask. It's no longer the center of the universe. It's no longer a requirement. It's basically now, well, do I or do I not need it? So in the face of all this change, what sort of key skills is an IT pro and a reseller going to need to focus on to be successful? So I've mentioned one of the key things I think is the long-term learning process. You really need to be learning on a regular basis as the world changes. On-demand learning from a search engine is too late. And again, you make mistakes, you miss things, you need to try these things beforehand. So you need to carve out time in your calendar on a regular basis to learn this stuff, to play with it, to see what it actually does. Everybody's busy, no question, but being busy is just another excuse for being unfocused, right? Focus on the stuff that you need to learn and make that part of your routine. Remove the stuff which is unprofitable, because again, the more you learn, the more services, the more knowledge you'll have, and the more that you can charge. You need to focus on the automation. Again, you can't do it all. Use automation technologies like Azure Functions, Microsoft Flow, if this then that, Zapier. Okay? Can the software or someone else do it? Work smarter. Again, how can we really optimize the systems that are out there using the tools that are available built in? Right? Add value via software and services. Don't try and do it hardware. Basically, the software is the stuff you create. The services is stuff you create. Add the value yourself. How do you automate this with PowerShell? How do you make things run faster with software and more consistently in that respect? What else can the services do for the customers? Okay, so we're moving away from billing for hardware, billing for IaaS. That's an old world reseller model. How do we add value? Software provides the opportunity to leverage and to grow beyond your standard market. We need to be systematic. Again, you need to be systematic in your learning and also how you develop software, your automation, your marketing, right? Show me the system. Make sure it's repetitive. Again, optimize. You can't do that with a system. Do random things happen, right? We don't want that. We want consistency, and that consistency comes from being systematic. And I would suggest to you a very key skill is learning to say no. You can't do it all. It might be interesting, but is it profitable? What's the system you have in place that helps you make a good decision? Okay, a lot of that is, okay, if it doesn't follow this criteria, no, I'm not going to do it. As much as I'd love to do it, I need to make a decision. And 9 times out of 10, it's going to be no. You need to focus. Saying no more will help you focus. So the conclusions that we'd have for this environment, this presentation, are that you really need to focus. If you don't, you're just going to burn out. What are you good at, right? As I said, the idea here is you don't do what you love, you do what you're good at. That's what people will pay for. That's where the skill set, that's what they want, all right? Not everybody will adopt or want something that you might love. It's what you're good at. People are willing to pay for that. You need to challenge your preconceptions. Why are you installing that domain controller, as I said, on-prem? Is that because it's the best way to do things? Or is it simply because that's the way that you're comfortable and you've always done it that way? All right, challenge the preconception. Why are we doing it this way? Why can't we do this with software? Why can't we script this? Why can't we make this faster? Why can't we deploy this quicker? Again, investment up front will pay off long term down the track. But challenge those preconceptions you've built up over time, which is natural for anybody. Embracing change. The world is constantly changing. Nothing we can do about it except come up with a system to deal with it. It's only going to accelerate. Show me your system for dealing with it, right? Remember to filter for the information that's of value to you. If it's not of value, again, filter it out. You don't want distractions, right? Create that filter, understand the filter, and be systematic about the ways you create that filter. Software. Software will eat the world. Show me your PowerShell. Software gives me the ability to write once and run many times. It gives me the leverage ability. Again, it's now key with all our systems, on-prem and in the cloud. It's all about software. The key one I would suggest for IT pros and resellers is PowerShell. Really, again, have some sort of understanding. Spend more time learning PowerShell. You will get the benefit because it applies on-prem as well as in the cloud. And constant education. You simply cannot keep up to date and you cannot learn on demand. It's too late, right? You're going to make mistakes. You're going to overlook things. You're going to configure things incorrectly. You need to have a process, a system of constant education, and that means learning yourself, upskilling via conferences and listening to other presentations, playing with the technology, talking to other people, doing documentation. The secret here is constant. Just don't do it now and again. Schedule it, make sure that it's happening on a regular basis. So I take this opportunity to thank you for listening to this presentation. Here are some additional resources of mine that you can certainly take advantage of. Everything from SharePoint training to tutorials to a podcast, training courses. You'll also see my contact details there. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any comments or feedback or suggestions about this presentation. And again, I thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this presentation of mine.